Okay, so I want to start by thanking Zoltan very much for the invitation to talk at this workshop, and also to offer a bit of an apology in that I'm not going to be saying a great deal about the wealth of materials that were covered at DPAG during the Sherrington Box project today. I can only offer two real reasons for this. And one is the rather prosaic one that the pace of historical research is often, unfortunately, glacially slow. That is, I haven't actually done the research to present to you yet. But the other, and I think more legitimate excuse here, is that I want to talk today about the relationship between nerve science and education in a somewhat more general manner. That is, now that Damien's highlighted the technical development and the new educational possibilities opened up by the Seaside site, I'm going to adopt the sort of the well-worn, curmudgeonly role of the historian and argue that in many respects, this project isn't new at all. That is, it's new, but that the connection between nerve science and educational innovation is definitely not new. So what I want to do today is place the Seaside project in a much longer-term historical context. That's within a tradition of educational and investigational reform by nerve scientists that stretches back at least to the mid-19th century, if not beyond. And this tradition, I will suggest, is intimately bound up with a form of learning practice that has been of intense interest to historians during the last 50 years or so, that of experimentation. So, for example, Simon Schaffer and Stephen Shapin have explored the 17th century origins of the notion of experiment as a kind of subjection of nature to testing, and many of others have discussed the emergence of a culture of experimentation amongst natural philosophers during the 18th century. Similarly, historians such as Tim Lenoir have highlighted that it was not until the mid to late 19th century that deliberately designed spaces for experimentation in the form of institutionally supported laboratories came to be established as a permanent feature of the intellectual landscape. And I think, not coincidentally, it was precisely in this late 19th century period that nerve science first began to gain respectability within the British educational system. That physiological writers who appealed to the body as a place in which mind emerges first began to gain positions in Britain's universities. So what I want to suggest today is that the emergence of an academically respected, if not at the time entirely respectable, science of the nervous system during the 19th century played a key role in the institutionalization of laboratories that occurred at this time. That nerve science, as it emerged in the 19th century, contributed to a reconceptualization of experiment, not only as a good way of finding out about nature, but also as a powerful means of training the minds of the nation's youth. Perhaps a bit perversely, though, I want to start by looking at a quote not from a nerve scientist at all, but from UCL's then Professor of Chemistry, Alexander William Williamson, at the opening of the university's brand new science faculty in 1870. Now, I think this quote encapsulates many of the concerns that motivated speeches calling for the establishment of laboratories in Britain's higher educational institutions during the 1860s and 1870s. So I want to look at it paragraph by paragraph. Firstly, the principal concern here, as you can see, and this will no doubt be familiar to many of you in the audience here today, is not really with the production of scientific knowledge or the pursuit of truth about nature. It's with the training of men of business. It's with the employment of science as a means of making Britain more competitive. Secondly, we can note that this business training for Williamson is above all practical. It's through the acquisition of experimental skill that the ability to contribute to industrial progress is gained. And finally, we can note that the equation of industry and experiment more generally, we can note the equation of industry and experiment more generally. Industry here is experiment. The two aren't simply complementary, but are different words for exactly the same kind of process. But the most important thing to note about this quote, I think, is its novelty. As Barry Barnes and Stephen Shapin have discussed some time ago, early 19th century literature on learning posited a radical distinction between intelligence on the one hand, which was a spiritual, otherworldly, and associated with non-practical knowledge, such as literary eloquence and mathematical ability, and skill on the other, which was mundane, earthly, and associated with bodily capacities and strength, with manual labour. Early 19th century pedagogues, at least in Britain, privileged a disembodied mind, a disembodied spiritual rationality that had as little to do as possible with more lowly practical bodily knowledge. And we can now add to that it would only be during the 1860s, 1870s and 80s, just as laboratories were coming to be established in most of Britain's higher educational institutions, that educational reformers began to articulate a conception of learning in which mind and body, head and hand, would work in conjunction as different elements of a single knowledgeable whole. So, one of the key elements of this change, I want to argue, was a now little remembered but then much discussed intellectual movement that went by the name of physiological psychology. But what was physiological psychology? In many respects, the movement was the immediate intellectual successor to one of the most fashionable sciences of the 1820s, 30s and 40s, that of phrenology. Like phrenologists, physiological psychologists, writers such as the radical reform-oriented Thomas Laycock, you can see in the middle at the top there, the popular writer on natural philosophy Herbert Spencer, on the far left, respectable Unitarian physiologist William Benjamin Carpenter at the bottom there, and Alexander Bain, one of the early pioneers of English as an academic discipline, argued that, as the common phrase of the time had it, the brain is the organ of mind. And also, like phrenologists, physiological psychologists attracted controversy and accusations of ungodliness and materialism. Yet there are also important differences between these two scientific trends. For example, physiological psychologists took great pains to differentiate themselves from what they saw as the overly simplistic assumptions of phrenology. Where phrenologists emphasized the universal accessibility of their science, physiological psychologists argued for the need to apply specialist knowledge to the understanding of the brain. The complex organ of the human brain, physiological psychologists argued, could not be understood without a thorough grounding in the operation of simpler nervous systems and of the gradual progression of nervous development throughout the animal kingdom. William Carpenter, for example, became a particularly prominent critic of phrenology and presented extensive critiques of the phrenological association of the base of the skull with a cerebral organ for amativeness or sexual desire. It was not surprising, Carpenter contended, that those he called mere human anatomists had mistakenly attributed this portion of the nervous system, which would be clear to anyone with a basic understanding of the nature of the animal kingdom, was clearly responsible for bodily movement with sexual desire. The problem was that they hadn't undergone a thorough training in the sciences. So physiological psychologists such as Carpenter differentiated themselves from phrenologists by appealing to their awareness of a broad range of scientific knowledge than their predecessors. Neuroscience couldn't be simply left to the anatomists and the pathologists of the human body. It had to be brought into contact with the sciences more generally, with physics, with chemistry, and with zoology. And although physiological psychologists disagreed on the precise relation between simple and complex nervous systems, what they did agree on was that nerve psychology had to be made scientific. And it would be in their efforts to relate their subject to one of the most broad-ranging scientific concepts of the 19th century, that of the conservation of force or energy, that physiological psychologists would begin to truly move away from their phrenological forebears. As well as being a prominent critic of phrenology, Carpenter was also one of the first physiologists in Britain to discuss the nervous system in terms of the conservation of force. In a Philosophical Transactions article of 1850, that's the same year that Helmholtz is publishing on nerve forces, he expounded a physiological vision in which forces or powers being constantly exchanged within the body. So, drawing on the work of German physiologists and also Italian physiologists, especially the work of Carlo Mattiucci on electric fishes, Carpenter argued that two kinds of force or power could be discerned within the body. On the one hand, he suggested, there was a specific kind of force associated with nerves. This was related in some way, although it wasn't exactly the same thing as electricity, in that nerves could be stimulated by electric shocks, and that in the case of Mattiucci's electric fish, could themselves generate them. Nerves were a site of exchange between electrical and what Carpenter called nervous forces. On the other hand, he suggested there was a different kind of exchange that occurred within the body, this time between his already discussed nerve force and a chemical kind of force that he associated with muscles. Nerves and muscles reacted on each other, manifesting an exchange of forces that was comparable to any other kind of change of state in nature. Importantly, and in many ways this was an idea that was unprecedented in Western physiological thinking, these bodily exchanges weren't simply manifestations of a hierarchy of action. It wasn't simply electricity acting on nerves which then acted on muscles, but were a genuine process of exchange. Muscle movement could stimulate nerves just as much as nervous action moved muscles. The body then became, in Carpenter's scheme, a site in which forces or powers were constantly being converted, moving in the process between different anatomical parts of the body. And nor was Carpenter alone in thinking along these lines. By the late 1860s, he'd been joined by Laycock, by Spencer and Bain, as well as others such as J.D. Morrell and Henry Maudsley in writing of this kind. A rapidly growing literature of the exchange of forces between muscles and nerves was growing up. And it was in this context, I want to suggest, that experimentalists such as Williamson's calls for the establishment of laboratories in Britain's educational and scientific institutions began to be heeded. The physiological, psychological reframing of the relationship between bodily action and intellectual activity that had been the subject of such anxiety during the early decades of the 19th century presented experimentalists with a language, a kind of rhetoric, with which they were able to persuade government officials of the necessity of spending large amounts of money on these new scientific institutions. And the figure who stands out most in this regard is, perhaps unsurprisingly for a future professor of English, Alexander Bain. Over the course of 2 books and a series of wide-ranging journal articles, Bain put forward a physiology-inspired conception of mind, in which the conventional psychological categories of sensation and intellect were reconsidered and indeed made subordinate to a third, that of movement. The concept of energy was fundamental to Bain's psychology. As he commented in introduction to his 1855 book, The Senses and the Intellect, I've thought proper to assign to movement and the feelings of movement a position preceding the sensations of the senses, and I've endeavoured to prove that the exercise of active energy originating in purely internal impulses independent of the stimulus provided by outward impression is a primary fact of our constitution. The primary activity of life is muscular. It's the spontaneous release of energy within the developing body, which, Bain suggests, results in uncoordinated outward bodily movement. As infants grow, or rather their nervous systems begin to control this release of energy by associating their uncoordinated movements with certain kinds of sensation. The sense of self thereby emerges as a result of an interaction between the expenditure of muscular energy and a sensational, nerve-based awareness of the environment in which this expenditure takes place. So bodily movement is made fundamental to intellectual development in Bain's psychology. As he commented as early as 1848, in chemistry there is one of the key implications of this contention was that skill-based learning, such as might be conducted in a laboratory, was crucial to the cultivation of intellect. So in chemistry, there's a discipline more than merely mathematical. The laboratory operations of testing and analysis, in which every blunder recoil on the operator, and where his knowledge, ingenuity, and watchfulness are incessantly on the stretch, must strongly be recommended for a disciplining of the reasoning and judging faculties. and in many respects it could be the best training that could be chosen. And it was comments such as these emanating from physiological psychological discourse in which bodily movement was elevated to a fundamental basis for psychological development that formed the basis for the establishment of an association between laboratory science and educational practice. Nor was this language confined to physiological psychologists. As early as 1852, the chemist, Whig politician and educational reformer Lyon Playfair commented on what many perceived to be the disappointing performance of British industry at the Great Exhibition. Labour is of two kinds, corporeal and mental, or as Mill calls it, muscular and nervous. The fact is, every day more apparent that mere muscular labour in the present state of the world is little better than raw material, and that both are sinking in value as elements of production, while nervous or intellectual labour is constantly rising. The whole of industrial competition is now resolved into a struggle to obtain a maximum effect by a minimum expenditure of power. But this power is derived from natural forces, not from brute strength. Mental labour has engrafted itself on muscular effort, and by a healthy growth has reduced the size and relative force of the latter. Similar rhetoric would appear in the 1867 to 1868 Government Committee on Instruction in the Theoretical and Applied Sciences, to which both Playfair and Carpenter were key witnesses, and which provided a major justification for the funding of laboratories after 1870. By this time, the language of physiological psychology, of the development of intellect as an exchange of nervous and muscular forces within the body, had come to be adopted by a wide range of commenters and advocates of the introduction of scientific education to Britain's schools and universities. So Spencer, but also Thomas Henry Huxley, the Professor of Chemistry at the Royal Institution, Edward Frankland, and John Burdon Sanderson, who was then Principal of the Brown Institute in London. These figures articulated a vision of experimentation as a means of educating the nation, not just scientific specialists, in the practical skills needed to maintain the economic strength of the nation, in the face of competition from emerging industrial nations such as the United States and Germany. Physiological psychology, though it would soon dissipate as an intellectual movement, had by the 1880s helped experimental scientists make their mark on the intellectual landscape. So this is all very well, I think some of you might be thinking, but where's Oxford fit in all of this? Well, it's slightly unfortunate that Philip Bealey, our other historian colleague on the project, can't be with us today, as he may well have been able to comment more fully on a much longer history of connections between nerve science and experimentation at Oxford. What I will note is that it may not be totally coincidental that perhaps the greatest thinker on nerves during the 17th century, Thomas Willis, was responsible for the sponsorship and introduction into polite society of a young Robert Hooke, who would go on to become one of the first proponents of recognisably experimental natural philosophy at the newly founded Royal Society. And, returning to the 19th century, it was with John Burdon Sanderson in the Oxford of the 1880s, along with Michael Foster's school in Cambridge, that the psychological commitment to experiment found both its ultimate expression in physiological science and, in some respects, its end. Figures such as Foster and Sanderson represented the emergence of a new professionalism in the physiological sciences, one in which one's attachment to a laboratory, and with it one's experimental ability, would be paramount. Such an environment would foster a new generation of students of the nervous system, who would place less emphasis on speculation regarding issues such as educational reform and the philosophy of mind, and more on the development and adaptation of equipment capable of revealing facts about the nature of nerves. And finally, it was in Oxford that one of the most talented of this new generation of students, Charles Sherrington, would settle in 1913. As I say, I need to do more research to tell you anything about that, unfortunately. But as a hope is now somewhat clear, C-Slide, this experimental tool for scientific education and historical research, can be fitted into a much broader tradition in which speculators and investigators of the nature of nerves have both contributed to and helped convince legislators of the importance of educational innovation in the sciences and beyond. For my own discipline, or at least my very own research, I think that sites such as this invite a kind of experimentation of their own. In this case with historical source material rather than the elements of nature. This slide provides me with a space in which I can experiment with different approaches to the analysis and presentation of historical materials, such as the association of text on aesthetics with the artworks that they reference, and the study of relations amongst groups of text. As such, this tool and others like it might be thought of as inviting an experimental, and by extension a neurological, aesthetic into historical research. Thank you.